The moment I realized the HOA president was standing in my driveway screaming about a ridiculous eyesore was the same moment I knew this whole thing was about to get beautifully complicated. My name is Zachary Kirkland, and I had just moved to Pinehurst Estates in Greensboro, North Carolina 3 months ago. The property was perfect, 5 acres on the edge of the development, bordered by woods on 2 sides and an old abandoned railroad right-of-way on the 3rd. The railroad tracks themselves had been pulled up decades ago, but the easement remained, a 30-foot wide strip of mostly overgrown land that cut diagonally across the back corner of my property. When I bought the place, the title search revealed something interesting. My property deed included ownership of that railroad easement where it crossed my land. The railroad company had dissolved in the 1970s, and through a series of transfers and acquisitions, the easement had reverted to the adjacent property owners. In this case, me. I didn't think much about it at first. It was just an overgrown strip of land with some gravel and weeds. But then I started noticing something odd. Every single car that entered or left Pinehurst Estates used a road called Maple Ridge Drive, which connected the development to the main highway. And Maple Ridge Drive crossed directly over my railroad easement about 50 feet from my property line. I pulled out my survey maps and property documents, spreading them across my kitchen table on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Sure enough, the survey was crystal clear. The railroad easement cut right through where Maple Ridge Drive had been built. The developers who created Pinehurst Estates back in 1998 must have just paved over it, probably assuming the easement was abandoned or that nobody would ever care. They were wrong about that second part. Now, I'm not usually the type to cause problems. I spent 20 years as a civil engineer before taking early retirement, and I understand property rights and easements better than most. But there was a reason I was suddenly very interested in this particular piece of legal trivia, and her name was Patricia Henderson. Patricia was the president of the Pinehurst Estates Homeowners Association, and from my first week in the neighborhood, she had made my life a nightmare. It started with a violation notice about my mailbox being the wrong shade of black. Then another notice because my grass was allegedly 1 inch taller than the allowed 4 inches, even though I had measured it myself at 3.5. Then came complaints about my truck being parked in my own driveway overnight, violations about my trash cans being visible from the street for more than 12 hours, and most recently, a $1,000 fine because I had planted azaleas instead of the approved boxwood shrubs in my front garden. Every week brought a new letter, a new violation, a new fine. The HOA board backed Patricia on everything, rubber stamping her petty tyranny with predictable regularity. I had tried reasoning with her, tried following every ridiculous rule, but nothing was ever good enough. 2 weeks ago, she had actually called the county code enforcement on me, claiming I was running an illegal business from my home because a friend's car was parked in my driveway during the day. The inspector came out, found nothing wrong, and told me privately that Patricia called them at least once a month about various neighbors. So when I discovered I owned the easement that the HOA's only road crossed, I'll admit a certain satisfaction crept into my thoughts. I spent the next 2 weeks doing research. I contacted a real estate attorney named Michael Brennan, who had an office in downtown Greensboro. He was in his 50s, with gray hair and the careful manner of someone who had seen every property dispute imaginable. "This is actually pretty straightforward," Michael said, reviewing my documents in his office. "You own the easement. The HOA or the developer built a road across it without securing proper legal permission or purchasing the right-of-way. Technically, they're trespassing." "What are my options?" I asked. "Well, you could demand they pay for an easement to use your property. You could revoke their access entirely, though that would be extreme and a court might not allow it, given it's the only road access. Or," he paused, a slight smile crossing his face, "you could assert your property rights in a way that makes your point very clear." "Such as?" "Such as installing a crossing gate. It's your property. You have the right to control access across it. As long as you're not completely blocking essential access, you can regulate it. Think of it like a private driveway that crosses someone else's land. The property owner has rights." I left Michael's office with a plan forming in my mind. The crossing gate arrived 2 weeks later on a sunny Thursday morning. It wasn't anything fancy, just a standard road crossing arm like you'd see at a railroad crossing, painted red and white with a small electric motor to raise and lower it. I hired a local contractor to install it right over Maple Ridge Drive where it crossed my easement. The concrete footings went in first, then the pole and arm, and finally the motor and control box. By noon, it was operational. The gate arm stretched across the full width of Maple Ridge Drive, blocking both lanes completely. I'd installed a simple intercom system with a button on a post beside the gate. Press the button, talk to me, and I'd raise the gate. Easy enough. I was standing in my front yard, admiring the installation, when the first car approached. It was a silver Lexus SUV, and I recognized it immediately. Patricia Henderson came to a stop about 20 feet from the gate, her face visible through the windshield transforming from confusion to rage in about 3 seconds flat. She threw her car into park, killed the engine, and stormed out. Patricia was 52, with short blonde hair, styled in that aggressive Karen cut that screamed, "I want to speak to your manager." She was wearing white capri pants and a pink blouse, her face already flushed with anger as she marched toward me. "What the hell is this?" she shrieked, pointing at the gate. "That's a crossing gate," I said calmly. "For the railroad easement. You can't just block the road. This is the only way in and out of the neighborhood." "I'm not blocking anything. You just need to request access to cross my property. There's an intercom right there." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Your property? This is a public road." "Actually, it's not. Maple Ridge Drive is a private road maintained by the HOA, and this section crosses my railroad easement, which makes it my property. I have the deed and survey right here if you'd like to see them." I held up the folder I'd been carrying. Patricia snatched the papers from my hand, her eyes scanning them furiously. I watched as the reality of the situation slowly dawned on her face. The survey was clear, the property description was unambiguous, and the title documentation was ironclad. This is harassment," she finally sputtered. "No, harassment is what you've been doing to me for 3 months. This is property rights. Now, would you like me to raise the gate so you can cross, or would you prefer to continue this conversation?" "I'm calling the police." She pulled out her phone and dialed 911 right there. "Please do," I said. "I'd love to have them confirm that I have every right to control access to my own property." 2 Greensboro police officers arrived about 15 minutes later. By that time, 3 more cars had backed up behind Patricia's Lexus, their drivers standing around looking confused and annoyed. I recognized Bill and Susan Crawford from 2 streets over, and young Tommy Martinez, who lived in the house closest to the development entrance. The officers were professional, listening to Patricia's increasingly shrill explanation about how I was holding the neighborhood hostage, then examining my property documents. The older officer, a sergeant named Rodriguez, studied the survey for a long moment before handing it back to me. "Madam, this is a civil property matter," he told Patricia. "Mr. Kirkland appears to own this easement, and if the HOA built a road across it without permission, that's something you'll need to resolve through the courts or by negotiating with him. He's not breaking any laws by installing a gate on his own property." "But he's blocking our access. We can't get in or out." "He's not blocking it," Rodriguez said patiently. "He's controlling it. There's a difference. If he was completely preventing access, that might be a different situation. But he's offering to grant access on request, which is within his rights as a property owner." Patricia looked like she might explode. Her face had gone from red to purple, and a vein was pulsing visibly in her temple. "This is absurd. You can't just—" "Madam, like I said, this is a civil matter. You'll need to work it out with Mr. Kirkland or contact an attorney." Rodriguez turned to me. "Sir, just make sure you're reasonable about granting access. If you start denying people the ability to get to their homes, we might have to get involved on public safety grounds." "I understand completely, officer. I have no intention of trapping anyone. They just need to ask permission to cross my property, same as I'd need to ask if I wanted to cross theirs." The officers left, and Patricia stood there trembling with rage. The other residents were looking at her expectantly, waiting for their HOA president to solve this problem. Fine," she hissed at me. "Raise the damn gate." "I'd be happy to. But first, I need you to acknowledge that you're requesting permission to cross my property and that you understand this is private property subject to my control." "I'm not signing anything." I'm not asking you to sign anything. Just press the intercom button and ask for access. That's all." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her running through options in her mind. Finally, she stomped over to the intercom post and jabbed the button so hard I thought she might break it. "This is Patricia Henderson requesting access," she said through gritted teeth. I pulled out my phone and pressed the app I'd set up to control the gate remotely. The motor hummed to life, and the red and white arm slowly lifted into the vertical position. Patricia marched back to her Lexus without another word and drove through. The other cars followed, each driver giving me curious or concerned looks as they passed. I lowered the gate once they were through. This was going to be fun. Over the next few days, I let everyone pass freely, just to establish the routine. Press the button, request access, gate goes up. Most people were polite about it, even friendly. A few asked questions about the property situation, and I explained it honestly. Several residents even expressed sympathy, mentioning their own problems with Patricia's overzealous enforcement of HOA rules. But I knew the real battle was just beginning. Patricia wasn't the type to accept defeat, especially not in front of the entire neighborhood. I had embarrassed her, challenged her authority, and worst of all, I had been legally right in doing so. The first salvo came in the mail on Monday. It was a certified letter from the Pinehurst Estates HOA board, signed by Patricia and all 4 board members. The letter informed me that I was in violation of multiple covenants, conditions, and restrictions from the HOA governing documents. The crossing gate was an unapproved structure that required Architectural Review Board approval. It was painted in colors not on the approved list. It constituted a nuisance to the neighborhood. And my harassment of residents by making them request access was a violation of community standards. The letter demanded I remove the gate within 72 hours, or face fines of $500 per day, plus immediate legal action. I showed the letter to Michael Brennan at our meeting Tuesday morning. He read it carefully, then set it down with a bemused expression. "This is nonsense. The gate is on your property, not HOA common areas. The covenants, conditions, and restrictions don't apply to your railroad easement because it's outside the platted subdivision boundaries, and you're not harassing anyone, you're exercising your legal property rights." So I can ignore this? Not entirely. You should respond formally, laying out your legal position. But yes, essentially you're telling them to pound sand. More professionally worded than that, of course. Michael drafted a response letter that afternoon. It was 3 pages of legal citations, property law precedents, and polite but firm language explaining that the HOA had no authority over my easement, that their road had been built on my property without permission, and that I was fully within my rights to control access. The letter concluded by offering to negotiate a formal easement agreement for fair market value, of course. I sent it certified mail Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, my phone was ringing constantly. I let most calls go to voicemail, but I recognized some of the numbers. Other residents wondering what was going on, a few board members trying to sound reasonable and find a compromise, and Patricia herself, who left 3 increasingly angry voicemails demanding I call her back immediately. Thursday morning, I found my mailbox had been knocked over during the night. It was lying in the grass, the post snapped cleanly at the base. I had a security camera covering my front yard, and the footage showed a dark-colored sedan with no front license plate driving slowly past around 2 in the morning, someone leaning out the window with what looked like a baseball bat. I filed a police report and ordered a new mailbox, this time with a steel post set in concrete. Friday brought a new letter from the HOA, this time from their attorney. The law firm of Morrison and Chase, based in Charlotte, represented the Pinehurst Estates Homeowners Association. Their letter was more professionally written than Patricia's, but the content was essentially the same. Remove the gate, stop interfering with road access, and face legal consequences. Michael's response was ready by Monday. He cited the same property law foundations, but added a few new elements. If the HOA wanted to sue me over the gate, he'd be filing a counterclaim for decades of unauthorized use of my easement. At fair market rates for a road easement in this area, that could amount to several $100,000 in back payments, plus interest. We'd be happy to discuss a settlement, of course. A formal easement agreement granting the HOA Perpetual access rights across my property could be arranged for a one-time payment of $50,000, or we could work out monthly access fees if they preferred. The number was intentionally high. I didn't really want $50,000. What I wanted was for Patricia Henderson to understand that her reign of petty tyranny had consequences and that she couldn't just bully people into submission with violation notices and fines. But I also knew this was likely to escalate before it got resolved. I wasn't wrong. The following Tuesday, I came home from grocery shopping to find Patricia Henderson and two board members standing in my front yard, examining my landscaping with clipboards and cameras. The other board members were Helen Morrison, a thin woman in her 60s who always looked vaguely disapproving of everything, and Richard Volker, a heavyset man in his 40s who worked from home doing something in finance. "Can I help you?" I asked, getting out of my truck with grocery bags in hand. Patricia turned with a predatory smile. "We're conducting an inspection of your property, as is our right under the HOA bylaws. We have reason to believe there are multiple violations. You're trespassing. Get off my property." "This is common area," Patricia said smugly. "Your front yard is subject to HOA maintenance standards, which means we have the right to inspect it." "My front yard is my private property. The HOA has easement rights for utilities, not for random inspections. You're trespassing, and I'm asking you to leave." Helen Morrison spoke up, her voice pinched. "We have photographic evidence of at least 12 violations of community standards. Your landscaping is overgrown. You have unapproved plant species. Your driveway has oil stains, and that metal shed behind your house is not on the approved structures list." I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm. "First, my landscaping is maintained according to county standards. Second, I removed the azaleas and planted the approved boxwoods you demanded. Third, any oil stains on my driveway are being addressed. And fourth, that shed is my detached garage, which was here when I bought the property and is clearly shown on the original site plans filed with the county." "We'll see what the board decides," Patricia said, "but I think we have more than enough evidence for another round of fines, which you still haven't paid from last time, by the way. You're currently in arrears for $3,200. I'm not paying fines for violations I didn't commit. Every single notice you've sent me has been either factually wrong or based on rules that don't apply to my property." Richard Volker stepped forward. He was sweating in the afternoon heat, his polo shirt sticking to his substantial belly. "Look, Zachary, this situation with the gate is getting out of hand. Why don't we all just calm down and work something out? You remove the gate, we'll waive your outstanding fines, and we can all move on." "The gate stays," I said flatly. "It's on my property, controlling access to my property, and I'm not paying fines based on Patricia's personal vendetta. Now please leave before I call the police again." Patricia's smile widened. "Go ahead and call them. We're not doing anything wrong. But you might want to check your mailbox. You have some new correspondence." They walked back to Patricia's Lexus, parked on the street, and drove away. I checked my mailbox and found yet another certified letter. This one informed me of an emergency HOA board meeting scheduled for Friday evening, where they would be voting on placing a lien on my property for unpaid fines and on taking legal action to force removal of the illegal gate structure. I called Michael immediately. "They can try to place a lien," he said, "but it won't hold up in court. The fines are bogus and they know it. As for the gate, we've already established your legal right to have it there. This is all bluster, trying to intimidate you into backing down." "So what do? "Attend the meeting if you want. It's technically open to all homeowners. Document everything. Let them make their threats on the record, and then we'll bury them in paperwork if they actually try to follow through." Friday evening came, and I drove to the community clubhouse where HOA meetings were held. The clubhouse was a modest single-story building near the neighborhood pool, with a meeting room that could hold maybe 50 people. When I arrived at 7, there were already about 30 residents there, far more than usually attended HOA meetings according to the neighbors I'd spoken with. Patricia sat at a table at the front of the room with the other 4 board members, Helen Morrison, Richard Volker, Janet Torres, and David McMahon. Janet was a middle-aged woman who worked as a nurse and generally seemed uncomfortable with Patricia's aggressive approach. David was retired military, late 60s, with a rigid bearing and a tendency to defer to Patricia on most issues. I took a seat in the back row and pulled out my phone, setting it to record audio. Patricia called the meeting to order and went through the usual preliminary business approval of last meeting's minutes, treasurer's report, update on pool maintenance. Then she got to what everyone was actually there to hear. Item 7 on tonight's agenda, Patricia announced, her voice echoing slightly in the room. The ongoing situation with Mr. Kirkland and his unauthorized gate installation. Every head in the room turned to look at me. Patricia continued, "As you all know, Mr. Kirkland has installed a crossing gate that blocks Maple Ridge Drive, our only access road. He's demanding payment for an easement he claims to own, and he's making all residents request permission every time they want to enter or leave their own homes. This is unacceptable, and the board has been working diligently to resolve the situation." I raised my hand. Point of order. I'm not demanding payment for anything. I've offered to negotiate a formal easement agreement, which is standard practice when one party needs access across another party's property. And I'm not making anyone do anything, I'm simply exercising my legal property rights. Patricia's jaw tightened. "You're not recognized to speak, Mr. Kirkland. This is a board meeting, not an open forum." "Actually," said a voice from the middle of the room, HOA bylaws allow any homeowner to speak on matters that directly affect them. I looked it up. The speaker was a woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. I'd seen her around the neighborhood but didn't know her name. Patricia glared at her. "Thank you, Mrs. Patel, but the board will determine when and if Mr. Kirkland can speak." "Now, as I was saying, I want to hear what he has to say," another voice called out. It was Bill Crawford, the older man who'd been stuck behind Patricia that first day at the gate. Several other voices echoed agreement. Patricia looked like she wanted to explode, but she nodded curtly. "Fine. Mr. Kirkland, you have 2 minutes to explain yourself." I stood up. "Thank you. The facts are simple. When this development was built in 1998, the developer paved a road across a railroad easement that I now own. They did this without securing legal permission or purchasing the rights to do so. That makes the road, at least the section crossing my property, an encroachment. I have every legal right to control access to my own property. I've installed a gate to do exactly that. It's not personal, it's property rights." "But why?" someone called out. "What's the point?" "The point is that for 3 months, the HOA president has been harassing me with bogus violation notices, unreasonable fines, and retaliatory complaints. I've tried reasoning with her, following her rules, and being a good neighbor. Nothing worked, so I decided to assert my legal rights in a way that makes my position clear. I'm happy to grant the HOA a proper easement for the road, but it needs to be formal, legal, and it needs to recognize that this is my property you're using." Patricia shot to her feet. "This is extortion. You're holding the entire neighborhood hostage because you don't like following the rules." "I'm not holding anyone hostage. I let everyone through every single time they ask. All I require is that people acknowledge they're crossing my property. That's it." "You want $50,000, Patricia shouted. "That was an opening negotiating position for a formal perpetual easement. I'm open to other arrangements. But yes, if the HOA wants permanent unrestricted access across my property, that's worth something." The room erupted in argument. Some people were angry with me, accusing me of being petty and vindictive. Others were questioning Patricia, asking why she couldn't just work something out. A few seemed genuinely curious about the legal issues involved. Patricia banged a gavel on the table, calling for order. "Enough. The board has already consulted with our attorney. Mr. Kirkland's claim to the easement is disputed, and we believe we have prescriptive rights to the road based on continuous use for over 20 years. We will not be extorted, and we will not pay for an easement we already have legal rights to." Michael had warned me this argument would come up. Prescriptive easements essentially, adverse possession for access rights, required open, notorious continuous use without permission for a specific period. In North Carolina, that period was 20 years. But there were problems with the HOA's claim. "Prescriptive easements require that the use be hostile," I said. "That means against the owner's interests and without permission. But the previous owner of my property probably didn't even know the road crossed his easement. It's at the far corner of his lot, and the original railroad right-of-way was overgrown and invisible. That's not hostile use. That's just use without objection because nobody noticed. Big difference. Let the courts decide that, Patricia snapped. The board moves to authorize legal action against Mr. Kirkland to force removal of the gate and to establish our easement rights. All in favor? Wait, Richard Volker said. Shouldn't we at least try to negotiate first? Legal action is going to cost the HOA money. Maybe we can work out something cheaper. We're not negotiating with someone who's holding us hostage, Patricia said coldly. Now vote. All in favor of authorizing legal action? Patricia and Helen raised their hands immediately. After a moment, David McMahon raised his as well, though he looked uncomfortable doing so. Richard and Janet kept their hands down. Motion passes 3-2, Patricia announced with satisfaction. Mr. Kirkland, you'll be hearing from our attorneys. This meeting is adjourned. People filed out, several of them stopping to talk to me. Most were curious, a few sympathetic. Mrs. Patel, the woman who'd spoken up earlier, introduced herself as Reena Patel. For what it's worth, I think Patricia has been out of control for years, Reena said quietly. She fined us $2,000 last year because our teenage son's car was supposedly parked on the street too long. It was 3 days, and he was visiting from college. We had to threaten to sue before she backed down. Why haven't people voted her out? I asked. Reena shrugged. Most people don't pay attention to HOA politics. Patricia runs unopposed every year because nobody else wants to deal with the hassle, and the people who do show up to vote are usually her friends and allies. Over the next several weeks, the legal maneuvering began in earnest. Morrison and Chase filed a lawsuit against me in Guilford County Superior Court, seeking an injunction to remove the gate and a declaratory judgment establishing the HOA's prescriptive easement rights. Michael filed our response, along with a counterclaim for the value of the easement and damages for harassment. In the meantime, I kept operating the gate. Every morning and evening, the intercom would buzz with residents requesting access. Some were friendly, some neutral, a few openly hostile. Patricia always pressed the button with excessive force and never said please or thank you. Then things took a nastier turn. I started receiving anonymous threatening letters in my mailbox. They were printed on plain paper, no return address, mailed from different zip codes around Greensboro. The messages were blunt. Remove the gate or face consequences. You're going to regret this. Accidents happen to people who don't know their place. I reported them to the police, but there wasn't much they could do without evidence of who sent them. I installed additional security cameras covering my entire property and driveway. 3 weeks after the HOA meeting, I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of breaking glass. I grabbed my phone and looked at the security camera feeds. 3 figures in dark clothing and ski masks were in my front yard, spray painting my truck and throwing rocks at my windows. I called 911 and stayed inside, watching the feeds. The vandals were thorough spray paint on my truck, my garage door, my front door. They knocked over the new mailbox I'd just installed, kicked over my trash cans, and smashed 2 of my front windows before running off into the darkness. The police arrived about 10 minutes after my call, but the vandals were long gone. The officers took a report and collected copies of my security footage, but the video quality wasn't good enough to identify faces through the ski masks, and the vehicle they'd arrived in was parked just out of camera range. The damage was extensive. Both front windows would need replacing, my truck needed repainting, and every flat surface seemed to be covered in bright red spray paint with messages like, "Remove the gate," and "Get out." I was exhausted and angry and more determined than ever not to back down. The insurance claim was a nightmare, but eventually they covered most of the damage. I hired a cleaning service to remove the spray paint and a glass company to replace the windows. The truck went to a body shop for a full repaint, and I added more security cameras with better night vision. 4 days later, Patricia Henderson was arrested. I got the news from Reena Patel, who called me that afternoon sounding excited. "Turn on Channel 2 News. You're not going to believe this." I switched on the TV and saw a news reporter standing in front of the Pinehurst Estates entrance. The caption read, "HOA, President Arrested in Vandalism Conspiracy." The reporter was explaining that Patricia Henderson, along with her son Brandon Henderson and Brandon's friend Tyler Koch, had been charged with conspiracy to commit vandalism and destruction of property. Apparently, my security footage had captured enough detail that a forensic video analyst was able to identify one of the vandals from his gait and build. That person was Brandon, Patricia's 26-year-old son who lived with her. When confronted by police, Brandon had confessed and implicated his mother as the one who planned the attack. I sat down hard on my couch, trying to process this information. Patricia had actually orchestrated the vandalism. She'd been so desperate to force me to remove the gate that she'd committed multiple felonies. The news got better. The police had also connected Patricia to the mailbox destruction from weeks earlier. Brandon had admitted to that as well, under her direction. My phone rang. It was Michael Brennan. "Have you seen the news?" he asked. Just now. I can't believe she confessed. Patricia gave a statement to police admitting she told Brandon to vandalize your property to scare you into removing the gate. She's claiming she was under extreme stress and not thinking clearly, but that's not going to help her much. These are serious charges. What happens now? From a legal standpoint, this completely destroys the HOA's case against you. Their own president committed crimes in an attempt to force you off your legal property rights. That's not going to look good to a judge. I'd expect Morrison and Chase to drop their lawsuit very quickly. As for Patricia, she's looking at criminal charges, restitution, and probably jail time if the DA pursues this aggressively. Over the next few days, the story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Patricia was released on bond but immediately resigned from the HOA board. Helen Morrison tried to step into the leadership role, but a group of residents led by Reena Patel and Bill Crawford called an emergency homeowner meeting to recall the entire board and elect new leadership. The meeting was packed. Nearly every homeowner in the development showed up, and the anger was palpable. People were furious that Patricia's vendetta against me had resulted in criminal charges and threatened the HOA's legal position. Others were angry about years of petty violations and unreasonable fines that they'd put up with out of fear or apathy. The vote was overwhelming. All 5 board members were recalled, and a new board was elected on the spot. Reena Patel became the new president, with Bill Crawford as vice president and 3 other reasonable-seeming neighbors filling out the board. Reena called me the next day. "I want to apologize on behalf of the HOA," she said. "What Patricia did was inexcusable, and it never should have gotten to this point. Can we meet and talk about resolving the easement situation?" We met at a coffee shop in downtown Greensboro. Reena brought Bill Crawford and the HOA's new attorney, a local real estate lawyer named Sarah Chen. They were professional, respectful, and clearly eager to find a solution. "Here's where we are," Sarah explained. "The previous board's lawsuit against you is being withdrawn. We've reviewed your property documents and your attorney's legal analysis, and we agree that you own the easement and have the right to control it. What we'd like to do is negotiate a formal easement agreement that works for everyone." "I'm listening," I said. Over the next hour, we hammered out the basics. The HOA would pay me $10,000 for a perpetual easement across my property, allowing unrestricted access for Maple Ridge Drive. In exchange, I would remove the gate and grant the HOA the right to maintain the road section that crossed my easement. The HOA would also drop all outstanding fines against me and issue a formal apology for Patricia's actions. It was fair. More than fair, really. The $10,000 wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. About having the HOA acknowledge that they'd been using my property without permission and that I had rights that needed to be respected. "I have one additional condition," I said. "The HOA needs to review its enforcement procedures and adopt new policies to prevent the kind of abusive, retaliatory behavior Patricia engaged in. I don't want what happened to me to happen to anyone else." Reena nodded immediately. "Agreed. In fact, that's already on our agenda. We're completely overhauling how violations are handled. Going forward, any fine over $200 requires a hearing where the homeowner can contest it. And we're implementing an appeals process with neutral third-party arbitration." We shook hands, and Sarah promised to have the formal easement agreement drafted within a week. The legal documents were signed 3 weeks later in Sarah Chen's office. The HOA cut me a check for $10,000, I signed over the easement rights, and everyone seemed relieved to have the situation resolved. The next day, I had the crossing gate removed and the area restored to a normal road surface. Patricia Henderson's criminal case moved through the court system over the following months. She pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit vandalism and destruction of property. The judge sentenced her to 18 months in prison, suspended to 3 years of supervised probation, 500 hours of community service, and restitution of $8,000 to cover my damages beyond what insurance had paid. Brandon and Tyler received similar sentences, though Brandon got some additional jail time for actually carrying out the vandalism. Patricia's husband divorced her about 6 months into her probation. The house went up for sale shortly after, and they moved away. I never saw her again. Life in Pinehurst Estates improved dramatically under the new HOA board. Reena Patel proved to be an effective and reasonable president, focused on maintaining property values and community standards without the petty tyranny that had characterized Patricia's reign. Violations were handled professionally. Fines were imposed only when genuinely warranted, and homeowners actually started attending meetings and participating in community decisions. I became friendly with several of my neighbors, especially Reena and Bill. We'd have occasional cookouts, help each other with yard work, and generally acted like a normal community instead of a police state. The railroad easement reverted to what it had always been, an overgrown strip of land at the back of my property, unremarkable and forgotten. I let the weeds grow and the trees fill in until you could barely tell there had ever been a road crossing there. But I kept the survey maps and the easement documents in my safe, just in case. Property rights matter, and sometimes you have to stand up for them, even when it's difficult and uncomfortable and turns your life upside down for a while. Michael Brennan and I stayed in touch as well. He'd send me occasional updates on property law cases he thought might interest me, and I'd refer other homeowners to him when they had disputes with the HOA or needed legal advice. He told me once that my case had become something of a legend in local real estate law circles the guy who owned the railroad easement the HOA forgot about. I retired from my engineering career, intending to enjoy a quiet life in a nice neighborhood. And for a while, it seemed like that wouldn't happen. But in the end, standing up to a bully and fighting for my rights not only solved my own problem, it improved things for everyone in the community. Patricia's removal and the HOA's restructuring benefited all my neighbors, even the ones who'd been angry with me for installing the gate. About a year after everything was settled, I was working in my yard on a Saturday afternoon when a moving truck pulled up to the house across the street. A young couple was moving in, looking excited and nervous the way first-time homebuyers always do. I walked over to introduce myself. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I said, shaking hands with the husband, who introduced himself as Marcus and his wife as Jennifer. "If you need anything or have questions about the area, just let me know." "Thanks," Marcus said. "We heard this is a great community, really reasonable HOA, good people." I smiled. "It is now. Took some work to get there, but yeah, it's a good place to live." They looked curious, but I didn't elaborate. Some stories are better told over time, once you get to know people. And besides, the crossing gate was long gone, the easement was properly documented, and Patricia Henderson was someone else's problem now. As I walked back to my yard, I glanced at the spot where Maple Ridge Drive crossed what used to be my railroad easement. Cars drove over it constantly, residents coming and going without a second thought. The road was smooth and well-maintained, the easement agreement filed with the county clerk, everything legal and proper. Property rights aren't just abstract legal concepts, they're about respect, boundaries, and the basic principle that people should be able to enjoy what's theirs without harassment or intimidation. Patricia Henderson had forgotten that, or maybe she'd never understood it in the first place. She'd thought her position as HOA president gave her unlimited authority to control other people's lives, to punish anyone who didn't conform to her exact specifications. She'd been wrong, and it had cost her everything: her position, her reputation, her freedom, and eventually her home and marriage. I didn't take any pleasure in her downfall. Despite everything she'd done to me, I actually felt a little sorry for her. She'd been so consumed by the need to control and dominate that she'd lost sight of basic decency and legality. And when challenged, instead of backing down or finding a reasonable compromise, she'd escalated until she crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. But the lesson was important, both for me and for the community. Standing up to bullies matters, asserting your rights matters. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply say no and refuse to be intimidated. The crossing gate had been a symbol, a physical manifestation of property rights that the HOA had ignored or forgotten. It had been controversial, disruptive, and more than a little petty on my part, but it had also been necessary. Without that dramatic assertion of ownership, Patricia and the old board would never have taken my concerns seriously. They would have kept piling on violations and fines, kept harassing me, kept treating me like a problem to be solved rather than a homeowner with legitimate rights. The gate had forced everyone to confront the reality of the situation. I owned the easement, the HOA needed my permission to use it, and all the violation notices and threats in the world couldn't change those facts. In the end, justice had prevailed. Not easily, not quickly, but definitely. The HOA had a new board that respected homeowners' rights. Patricia faced consequences for her criminal actions, and I had my peaceful retirement in a nice neighborhood, free from petty tyranny and bogus fines. Sometimes you have to fight for what's yours. Sometimes you have to stand your ground even when it's uncomfortable and people think you're being difficult. And sometimes, just sometimes, doing so makes things better not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. The railroad easement taught me that. A strip of land 30 feet wide, overgrown and forgotten, that once carried trains across the Carolina countryside. The trains were long gone, the rails pulled up, the railroad company dissolved into history. But the property rights remained, documented in deeds and surveys, waiting for someone to notice and assert them. I noticed. I asserted. And in doing so, I reclaimed not just a piece of land, but my dignity and my right to live in peace on my own property. That was worth more than any easement payment, any legal victory, any satisfaction at seeing a bully brought down. It was about principle, about standing up for what was right even when it was hard. The crossing gate is gone now, dismantled and hauled away. But its impact remains in the reformed HOA, in the new policies that protect homeowners, in the community that learned to stand up to abusive authority, and in the knowledge that property rights matter, boundaries matter, and respect matters. I went back to my yard work, enjoying the sunshine and the quiet satisfaction of a Saturday afternoon well spent. Life was good in Pinehurst Estates. It had taken a fight to get here, but it was worth it. And if another Patricia Henderson ever showed up, well, I still had those survey maps in my safe. Property rights don't expire, and neither does the willingness to defend them. But I hoped it wouldn't come to that. The neighborhood had learned its lesson, and so had I. Sometimes the best defense of your rights is simply living peacefully and making sure others can do the same. The crossing gate had served its purpose, made its point, and earned its place in local legal legend. Now it was just a memory, a story to tell new neighbors over backyard cookouts, a reminder that even in the modern world of homeowner associations and community standards, individual property rights still matter and still prevail when properly asserted and defended. The trains might be gone, but the easement remained. And so did the principle. This is my property, and no HOA president gets to forget that, no matter how powerful they think they are.